Simon, it's so good to see you here today.
Great to see you too, Sharon. Thanks very much for inviting me to speak today.
And I was so impressed with you when we ran a conference earlier this year on trees, planning and construction, because you were our eco on the spot and you talked about biodiversity net gain. And biodiversity net gain is a new piece of legislation which is now mandatory in the UK. And it's really changing the face of development in a positive way. But there are a few teething troubles. So let's start from the very beginning. And particularly as we have international visitors. Hello in Australia and New Zealand and Japan and also our friends in North America. So you're very welcome to be here. So tell us, what is biodiversity net gain in a nutshell?
Okay, great. Well, yeah, biodiversity net gain has sort of become mandatory this year in England, and that it's a system whereby to kind of across the whole country prevent the ongoing loss of natural habitats and wildlife and species. We've now got a system that is mandatory within the planning process, where for any given site that's going to be developed or that's going to have some changes made to it, like a change in management, or they just want to create a gain in biodiversity, but mainly we're talking about planning applications. We have to measure the site before any development work happens, and when I say measure the site, I mean we plot what habitats are there, what green habitats, whether that's trees, grass, a pond, whatever's there, including, you know, plotting out what buildings are there and what hard areas. And then we compare that to what is designed to be there, what's proposed to be there as part of this change, which, as I say, is usually part of a planning application. So that might include a new building, a new car park, some more great landscaping, some shrubbery, some more trees, fewer trees, who knows. And that all goes there and gets measured in the same way. And you compare the two, and what is nationally mandatory is that the result out of that comparison is 10% better 10% better afterwards than it was before. And that's measured in a really big spreadsheet, basically, that is given to us by the government. And within that spreadsheet, we select all the different habitat types that were there and how big they were and what condition they were in, how good they were. And that's how the calculator works, and it gives us a number. It can get quite complicated. There's a lot for everyone to learn at the moment, but there's guidance out there to read. So on the whole, the overall result is that we're moving from a position where perhaps biodiversity and ecology in the past has been kind of either kind of neglected to some extent, or sometimes people just weren't sure quite how to measure it, to look at whether something was better after the development was done than before, or vice versa. You know, if an area of bramble was removed but some bird boxes were put up, is that better or is that worse? You know, you can't say. So for better or for worse, what we now have is a much more measured system. Yeah, and that's basically it. Is that a decent summary of it, do you think?
I think that's really, really brilliant. So a few things to pick out of that. So your role as ecologist, you're instructed by a house builder, for example, who wants to do some development on a, let's say it is a farmer's field with a small copse on the side and a pond. And the farmer knows, I mean, maybe this farmer isn't terribly scrupulous and thinks, oh, crumbs, I want to put this application in. And he gets his farm workers to clear the copse and fill in the pond. Okay, let's ignore any legislation around felling licenses, etc. How would that work? So you rock up on site and you think, hang on a minute, there's a whole bunch of stumps here and it looks like a pond's been cleared. What, can they get away with that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and actually, you know, a few years ago when we had BNG, biodiversity net gain, on the horizon, it was obviously one of the main concerns. And as you say, some cynical developers or landowners will try and do that preemptively, knowing that it's going to be measured at some point soon. but luckily in the system, the biodiversity net gain system is quite clear about that, which is that any the baseline measurement, which is to say before anything is done on site, has to be done before any development related activity. So if the clearance that was done was something that was part of the year-on-year management of that site, let's say it's an arable field, and it's just been the crop's just been harvested, and it's bare ground, then that's fine. You know, there's a category for arable fields, and that's all fine. But if it was a copse, or it was an area that's, you know, gone wild over the previous decades, and that suddenly gets cleared, and then, you know, the next year you've got somebody making a planning application there, that's quite clearly related to that development. And so what we have to do as people doing this assessment is we look back at historical, you know, imagery and say, hang on a minute, you know, that this has recently been cleared. The guidance for biodiversity net gain tells us that we have to retrospectively go back and try and tell what was there previously. And when we do that, we have to take a bit of a cautious stance, which is that you know, what's the best that it could have been? If we haven't got any specific pictures, or there's not remnants of what was there, we kind of have to take a bit of a guess, and we have to be precautionary about it. So in some cases, the idea of preemptively clearing a site actually backfires, because they end up with a result that ends up, or rather the assessment ends up being better than it might have otherwise been if they'd just left it as it was and let us go and see the thing.
Yeah.
So that's the answer to that dilemma.
That's a really good point. And the objective is to leave the new development better for nature than it was before. But you can see that can be really, really challenging. Let's go back to our farmer's field with a copse and a pond on the side. It's kind of like a no-brainer that the development might happen within the farmer's field, and the copse would be managed and the pond enhanced, or just left as it is. And you can see in that situation that you could plant new trees within that farmer's field where currently it's arable, new shrubs, create linear connectivity between habitats. But what about a more complex site? What about an urban site, what we call a brownfield site in the UK, which has had stuff on it in the past, but now there's 30 trees, a bit of scrub, a hedgerow, etc. And necessarily, particularly with this current Labour government's drive to increase urban density, which I'll come on to later, the chances are there's going to be more trees removed, some flats put up, some houses. Hard standing. It's hard to see that you would achieve 10% net gain. And if you can't, what happens then? What are the options?
Yeah, great. And it's certainly true. You know, not all sites that are due to be developed really do lend themselves to actually achieving an improvement in nature at the same time as including quite a dense development. You know, you're lucky as a developer if you've bought a site that has enough sort of empty space going on with no real greenery in it to develop and achieve what you want to achieve, and you can have a lovely wildlife zone going on with all sorts of ponds and enhancements. Great, good for you. That's what we like to see, but it's not always the case, especially in a suburban site that's really quite constrained. And you want to be able to make the most of that site by actually fitting in not just one house, but, you know, whatever it is you want to fit in, 10 houses or a block of flats. So I think that the process is twofold, really, when developers are looking to design a development, and one of which is to actually acknowledge the sort of harder constraints that are there. So if it's a woodland, you know, they're likely to be able to leave that woodland as it is, and let's try and work around that, because that, apart from anything, that carries a big value in the biodiversity calculator. So you're going to really lose out on credits if you need to get rid of part of the woodland, and also all sorts of other legislation covering the woodland as well, which I won't go into now. So features like that are best left in place. But you've also got grassland, bramble, scrub, and all these things, which also do carry quite a high value in the calculator, and you're going to be losing credit for removing them, and you may well have to remove them to get anything developed in the site. And so the first part of the process is to include high value habitats, really good quality habitats within the landscape design, and retain what you can of what's already there, and try and sort of have those two things work together. You know, retain what's there, create a nice landscape scheme, you'll get a result in the calculator for that, and it may well be a negative result. It will be a minus number, and we see that all the time. You want to get the minus number down as much as possible to show as part of your planning application that you're doing your best to get a nice, pleasant green site. But as a backstop, developers needn't worry too much, because there is the possibility to compensate for any shortfall that's happened within the site by going off-site and making ecological improvements, biodiversity improvements, habitat improvements off-site. That could be in the neighbouring piece of land that happens to be owned by the same landowner, and great, create a wildlife area there with lots of nice habitats. Or it could be something that's a bit distant and happens to be owned by the same landowner, or they're able to purchase it. Or it could be part of a scheme, a more large-scale scheme, either run by the local council. The national government, in fact, offers credits as part of their national scheme, or it could be that somebody like the Wildlife Trust or the National Trust or a big landowner nearby has organised themselves to create biodiversity offsetting plots and create a load of habitats on a big scale, so that they can then sell off the credits to developers who are needing to cover a shortfall within their own kind of constrained site. And then that will meet the need that the developer needs to demonstrate to get their planning permission.
So the principle of the legislation is sort it out on site first. It's going to be cheaper for you, Mr. Developer or Mrs. Developer. But if you can't, offset as near as possible, preferably on your own land. But if you can't do that, you buy credits, and they're not cheap, are they? But I guess with the buying credits, it has resulted in some really innovative rewilding projects and land management projects. We interviewed Braxted Park, Duncan Clark, earlier last season when we talked about his rewilding project, which is transforming an Essex farm. And I recently visited another farm in Harold Wood, which is being rewilded now by a wonderful organisation. So there is this benefit of money being poured into sort of rewilding projects on a way that wouldn't have been facilitated before. But ultimately, I take myself back to my interview with Nadina Gallet earlier, a few weeks ago, when we need nature on our doorstep. I want to ask you a question about the implementation of biodiversity net gain in terms of landscaping schemes. Now, quite often now, I see this rush to get 10% on a construction site. And as part of that rush and tweaking and massaging every little thing, some things are simple. But some of the landscaping schemes are good for nature. But are they practical? And I wonder what your thoughts are about small urban gardens where somebody's got a little patch of garden and it's laid to meadow. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that is something. It's something we've come across, and it seems like a good idea to pick up some points on a tiny piece of land within a development scheme. And I think, you have to bear in mind when we as ecologists or the landscapers or the developer are kind of working together to come up with a design that is trying to maximize the biodiversity net gain points and work, within the layout and the constraints of actually developing the site in the way it needs to be done. In the specific case of tiny pieces of meadow, the question is, can it be maintained sustainably for minimum of 30 years, which is actually a time period set within the biodiversity net gain system. And if you think, that there's no way in 20 years' time that meadow that was laid on a 5 meters by 5 meters piece of parcel in the site is still going to be maintained as such, then it shouldn't be targeted in the first place, because one of the key principles really is don't overpromise just to satisfy the calculator. Be realistic about not just what can be created on day one, but what can stick around for 30 years, and just accept that there are limitations on what can realistically be maintained.
I really love that honest and balanced approach, because quite often it may be planted as meadow. And I'm thinking of, say, terraced modern housing with little patches of meadow in front. The reality is, when it comes to the sales people trying to sell those units, they go, oh, that looks scruffy. And then people start putting in their sort of dahlias and what have you. But let's go back to let's start with trees. So, as an arboriculturalist, I go out on site and do the tree survey to the British standard. And there are 4 categories: A, B, C, and U. U being unsuitable for retention, either through disease, it might be dead, it might be structurally hazardous. As an ecologist, how do you value trees on site?
So, I mean, here at TMA, we have our own in-house arboricultural team and landscape and ecology. So we work together. And this is really the point you just mentioned about the discrepancy between the tree value in the BS 5837 standard used by arboriculturalists, and particularly the new biodiversity net gain valuation of trees. That discrepancy is really quite a key point that we all have to be very aware of and kind of navigate together, and try and not come across with completely separate stories, completely separate pieces of advice for the people that we're working with, because in the biodiversity net gain system, actually all trees are really quite highly valued. They carry a high score. It does depend on the size of the tree and the condition of the tree, which is determined by various factors. But more or less any tree does carry quite a high value when compared to other habitat types. Trees have really been set as a high value habitat. And so what we do have, and it is still a dilemma, there's no easy answer to it, is that sometimes there's a tree which, in the context of the site being developed, is going to be totally in the wrong place. It's not a good tree, and it might be quite a small tree, and it's going to take a prominent position in a new development, and yet it carries this high value in the biodiversity net gain system. And so, we have to work with our arboriculturalists to say, okay, your advice is that tree should come out, but now we have to temper that a little bit more and say, let's work together and see. If it needs to come out, then it can come out. We just have to work with the client so that they're also aware of the balance in biodiversity net gain credits only, that the implications that will have, and what that means in terms of replacing the tree, and getting back, compensating for the credit lost through that, which, by the way, is not as simple as just putting in one tree to replace one tree.
Oh, excuse me a second. Hello?
Hi, Sarah Dodd here.
Sarah?
Have you got your ticket yet for the Tree Law Conference?
Ah, yes, good. I wanted to speak to you about that, actually.
They are selling out 17th of September, Lincoln's Inn in London, and we've got a surprise slot in the afternoon, so don't delay, buy your ticket today.
So a key thing worth understanding in the biodiversity net gain metric is that habitats that are created carry a lower score than the same habitat being lost. So if you have a tree and it needs to be removed, that might have a score of 0.2 biodiversity units. But to replace it with the same tree again, a similar tree somewhere else, you don't get the same value back. And the reason why is because the metric has a factor that kind of accounts for the time for habitats to establish, and some element of the risk factor of them not quite happening properly, all of this, meaning that you don't get as high a score for the habitats you're creating as the same habitats that were already there. And another reason why, as far as possible, you want to hold on to what was already there, because it carries this value that is harder to recreate. And so what you may end up having to do is to, in the case of a tree, compensate with a bigger tree, a better tree, or multiple trees in most cases, which means that often we find that the developer is seeking places within their development site to stick trees wherever they can stick trees, if they're chasing, the score in the biodiversity net gain calculator to get their 10%. And I think we always have to kind of advise, yes, everyone wants to see that 10% achieved. Every effort should be made to achieve it, but you know what's created does need to be appropriate. And if at the end of the day it's too many trees in the wrong places, and you need to lose that one or two trees, you know, that are there, that needs to be accepted, and you know, use the off-site option to put new trees somewhere where new trees should go, that's not within the development site, to compensate.
Oh, I so agree with you. And I am not experiencing that at the moment. So I can think of several cases where a site is being absolutely stuffed with trees in a way that is not going to be enjoyable for the people using that space in the future. It may be a little cul-de-sac of 5 houses, and suddenly every single space in, because we can't count back gardens, in the front garden and along verges next to drives is stuffed with trees, which actually is not sustainable because it's going to overly shade, it's going to prevent any other type of habitat. Let's just go back to this sort of what you call trading rules. Can I take an example of a sort of early mature tree which has a diameter of, let's say, 550 millimeters, or let's say 2 foot for our American friends? So a sort of medium size tree that's got to come out. How many new trees would you need, or is it not as simple as that?
Well, it would depend on various factors, but we can use an example which I do have actually. First of all, it does depend on factors like the condition of that tree, essentially the condition score of that tree, which is determined by its setting, whether it has vandalism, and all these things that actually does feed into the score for that individual tree. But if we say that we're looking at a tree with a moderate, medium condition score, let's see, I think I have it here.
So this assessment you're doing as the ecologist, the assessment of the trees, the ARB is doing their assessment of the trees. Never the twain shall meet, or do you always look at the ARB assessment as well?
Well, actually, we make great use of the ARB assessment, yeah, because in our case, we're lucky enough to have, you know, both teams under one roof, meaning that the ARB guys go out and they actually do half of our work for us, because they're plotting the trees in the right place, they're identifying the species, they're measuring the stem, they're recording, actually, in our case, the information that needs to be recorded about that tree so that we can put that into the biodiversity net gain calculator. So that's all great. That's all sort of saving us a lot of time, and everything's correct. So we really use their information. I think the part where the discrepancy comes in is recommending, you know, what might be recommended for that tree from an arboricultural point of view may not be the same as just looking at the metric score for biodiversity net gain. But I have the figures in the example of an existing medium tree. It's worth, based on the factors that I'm imagining, 0.13 units.
So I'm picturing this oak, this medium-sized oak. It's not doing too badly. Maybe it's growing in the pavement. It's got a bit of dead wood. So tell us about how that might be replaced.
Okay, yeah. So the actual score that tree would get does depend on a few factors, one of which is what condition that tree is in, which has its own criteria to form that part of the metric. But let's assume it's in a medium condition. And is a medium size in the size categories that are given, then that's worth 0.13 units. To plant a new tree of a medium size, medium condition actually gets 0.05 units. So 0.13 for the existing tree, 0.05 for the new one. So actually, to directly compensate for the removal of the original tree, you'd need to plant 3 new ones to compensate. But it's not actually that simple, because
I was going to say, how big would these new trees be? They'd be massive, wouldn't they?
Yeah, so the guidance that's been issued is that new trees should not be counted as medium size. They should be counted as small trees. And a small tree carries even less value. A small tree carries 0.013 units. So if it were a medium tree planted 0.05, but because it needs to be a small tree, it's 0.013 units. So actually what that equates to is, for your medium tree, that you're losing 11 new trees to compensate for the loss. And so you can see that there's a lot of pressure, therefore, to keep that original tree.
That's good though, isn't it? But I can tell you what's happening to me, and I wonder if any ARBs can relate to this. So now, because we want to keep the trees, because essentially you've got more chance of achieving the 10% net gain, some of the stresses on these trees that we now have to keep are a little bit unrealistic and worrying. So we're now saying, no, it's okay, this building can go super close to that tree, or we can do this right next to this tree. And whilst we really think, well, that's great because there are technical ways to achieve wonderful things, the budget might not be there. So I think there's going to be quite a strain on some of the trees that we now have to keep. And the other thing that I've experienced in the last 2 weeks, I've had several sites where we're keeping U category trees. Now, I know that we discussed it earlier, but I'm going to just put my head on the block here and say, I know that some U category trees, they have like features which are good for wildlife. But the fact is they're reaching the end of their safe, useful life expectancy. Now, I'm being pure ARB here. But don't we have an opportunity to leave a legacy for the future and plant something new and better? So I'm not completely comfortable with that.
No, I absolutely agree with you, Sharon. I think that if the biodiversity net gain system is about creating a country in which biodiversity is in a better state than before, that doesn't mean retaining every dead and dying tree at all costs in the middle of a development site, looking horrible and causing a hazard. You know, that does include looking to the future, what's appropriate in the position that they're in, what is going to persist. And at the end of the day, you know, part of the assessment is to look 30 years in the future. And like I mentioned, that if we commit to a meadow grassland in the middle of a development, that needs to still be there in 30 years. A tree with a life expectancy of 5 more years is not going to be fulfilling that. And it's going to have disappeared, you know, afterwards. So when anyone comes back to see whether what's there afterwards matched, you know, the landscaping scheme, you know, those trees are not going to persist. And so, although it's not in there currently, I would think it would be a great idea if in future iterations of biodiversity net gain that there was able to be some kind of recognition of the assessments of professional arboriculturalists as to the, you know, the life expectancy of trees for the future, and perhaps even a kind of separate category so that those trees can be listed and not treated in the same way, which is kind of geared towards retention almost at all costs, and that we could sort of put those U category trees with the right expertise into a category where it's a bit more lenient as to, replacing them with something better, with a better life expectancy for the future.
Simon, can you rewrite the BNG for the government, please? Because that's absolutely bang on it, isn't it? You know, they won't be there in 30 years' time. We're missing opportunities to create new landscape. Perfect. Now, the other thing that's caused a little bit of controversy with friend of the show, Julian Forbes-Laird, and he talked about the different definitions of what a veteran tree is. So, listeners, if you really want to dive very deep indeed into this, it's an episode, a few episodes back, and perhaps you could just give your thoughts. So what Julian is saying, the National Policy Planning Framework says one thing, and BNG says another, in that you only need 2 criteria. What are your thoughts on that?
So for the full detail on that, I recommend anyone to listen to Julian's excellent analysis of that kind of issue that he's found and highlighted, which is great. You know, when we've got a system now which is biodiversity net gain that is really measuring things that were never really measured before, and being really very prescriptive about how things must be assessed, then it's very important that we do delve into the detail of exactly what any definitions mean, so that there's consistency, because consistency, after all, is, you know, one of the key aims of this. So yeah, that's a great podcast by Julian, and essentially what Julian highlighted is that the new definition of veteran trees. Well, first of all, why is there a new definition? That's a good question, but there's a new definition under the biodiversity net gain regulations, which are a law, and that new definition sets a much lower bar, apparently, than previous definitions that we were working with, which are still in place under the National Planning Policy Framework. So it creates this gap between the definition there, which was a higher bar, an exceptional bar for veteran and ancient trees, and now the sort of newer definition which we'd need to follow under biodiversity net gain, which sets a much lower bar. And what Julian highlighted is it's probably too low a bar, and it sort of means that potentially trees that are not really anything special are being classed as veterans, and quite a high percentage of trees that's too high, which actually waters down the protection of those trees that really are special veteran and ancient trees. And when that happens, it means that potentially people are even going to, you know, the constraint is too tight, the constraint is not feasible, meaning that perhaps there are more threats on those trees by, you know, cynical developers to try and get that constraint out of the way. And so, well, I think that, you know, from my point of view, I do think there's hope. I think it's very important to analyse these things, but from looking at it, I think there's hope. And one of the good things is that I think it makes it's an important place for the appropriate experts, ARB consultants in this case, to actually be involved and make sure that the new definition is interpreted in the right way, because it is a definition, but it includes words that do need to be interpreted, like significant decay, large girth, high value for nature, and particularly when we're talking about significant decay features, you know, what's a significant decay feature? I think that ARB consultants and ARB experts can help us to maybe, you know, think about what that would mean. And what's a large girth? You know, it's a relative term, and so who knows? Well, ARB consultants know, because they look at a lot of trees, so they know that for a given species that is a large girth. And I think that hopefully allows the right experts to be able to, you know, flex that definition without going away from it to a position where it actually is covering the exceptional trees, where significant decay is significant relative to the decay that you see typically, and the girth is large relative to trees that you see typically, so that we're not protecting typical trees as irreplaceable habitats, which is what this legislation is. We're only protecting the really exceptional trees in that way, although the word exceptional is kind of like drifted out of the new definition. So that's the first thing to say about that, and hopefully it kind of, for the ARB consultants and the ecologists who are really, you know, want to engage with this, I really hope that's a place for them to actually be involved, and that, for instance, myself as an ecologist putting forward an assessment, a biodiversity net gain assessment, if I have you know, a judgment by suitably qualified arboriculturalists saying this tree is a veteran because it has these features, this tree is not, it's not, you know, because it doesn't have these features, or the features it has are very typical, you know, I think it would be quite hard to argue with that, even with the new, you know, definition. And I think there are a lot of places in the biodiversity net gain guidance where, although it's very prescriptive, it does require justification. It still requires decisions to be made, and quite subjective decisions, and justification on them. The other thing to say, just on in terms of the concerns that were raised in Julian's chat with you about the preemptive felling of trees, if they were, you know, providing too much of a constraint, and they may end up being veteran trees under biodiversity net gain rules, but not under the planning framework rules, and perhaps there weren't any legal mechanisms to stop them from being preemptively felled. Well, actually, as we mentioned earlier in this session, the preemptive clearance of a site or felling of trees would get captured into the biodiversity net gain system. So we would look back and see if there were trees on a site that had been cleared in relation to the development, albeit preemptively, and we would need to include those in the metric. Whether or not they were veteran trees, it would be a tricky point to try and decide, and you'd have to be, perhaps quite bold to say, well, we don't know if they were veteran trees and they're not there anymore, so we'll say they're all veteran trees. We would have to sort of apply some common sense to that. But if they were large mature trees that had been cleared, we have to bear in mind that anyone from the planning authority might say, how do you know they weren't veteran trees? If you don't know and you can't explain why they're not veteran trees, then you have to class them as veteran trees. And class them as irreplaceable habitats, and the developer ends up, much worse off than if they just left them there and let us assess them.
Hi, I'm Keith Saker, and you're listening to Tree Lady Talks.
Thank you for clearing up that latter point, which I think is really, really important, as well as your analysis on that. And it kind of brings me neatly on to one of our listener questions. So this is from Frances Heskev of the Environment Partnership, and she asks about, what do you think about arboriculturalists doing the BNG assessments, and how far into ecological territory should ARBs go before competence becomes an issue? Because she's seen non-woodland habitat condition assessments done by ARB-led consultants.
Well, I think that certainly the tree and woodland elements of biodiversity net gain absolutely can be done by arboriculturalists. And actually, ourselves having the tree data collected by arboriculturalists is excellent for us. I think many of the criteria are phrased such that an ecologist could understand them, a landscape architect might understand them, and an ARB would understand them. But actually, let's have the ultimate experts on this collecting that data, and that's the ARBs. In many cases, we as ecologists collect that data, and that's fine. But what we would do is, if there's something that we're perhaps in doubt about, is this tree a veteran, for example, we'll look at it with our arboricultural colleagues and sort of figure it out that way. So I think absolutely ARBs should certainly be well placed to collect the BNG data, condition assessments for tree-related habitats. I think possibly if there were habitats that are not tree-related and are quite niche habitats, possibly that wouldn't be something that would be done by ARBs. But nor would it be something that would necessarily be done by any old ecologist.
Exactly.
If it's a valuable grassland habitat, for example, the assessment would need to be done firstly at the right time of year and by the right person who's able to properly assess the criteria, the habitat classification and also the condition assessment. So it's not even as easy as saying, well, this is for ARBs or ecologists, this is for ecologists only. There are some things that need the right ecologist, and there are other habitats that more or less can be done by most ecologists. There are some habitats that don't even have condition assessments, like a introduced shrub or a bramble scrub, for example. They just are what they are.
So it's all about working within our professional competence and experience.
Yeah.
So, no, I agree with that. So we've had a question from Steve Westmore, who's a well-known arboricultural consultant here in the UK and a trustee of the Arboricultural Association. He's asked a question about, what are your thoughts on the overarching emphasis on planting just native trees and the potential lack of diversity for new tree structure, and although he doesn't say this, so sorry, Stephen, but particularly in the urban settings, resilience to climate change. What are your thoughts on that? And actually, first of all, how prescriptive is BNG on species selection for replanting? And secondly, if it is restrictive, what are your thoughts on that, please?
Yeah. So as far as I understand it, and there is a lot to kind of know about BNG, and we're doing our best, but we can't know every single fact, not off by heart quite yet. But what I can tell you is I'm pretty sure that the native element for trees comes in as one of the criteria on the condition assessment. So the condition assessment consists of a number of criteria, and depending on how many of those criteria are met, the tree gets a condition rating, good, moderate, or low. And based on that rating, that affects the score that that tree gets, as well as the size and a few other factors. And whether it's a native species or not is one of those criteria. So it's not that everything is geared towards having native species, but in some cases that decision about a native species or not could be the difference between one rating to another, and that rating could be the difference between, one score to another overall on the site, particularly if you're talking about multiple trees. Could even be the difference between achieving 10% or not. And I understand that, particularly with climate change and the changes that are going to happen over the next 30 years, that the native tree is not always the right tree. And I absolutely agree with that. I'm not an expert in that. I'm not an arboriculturalist. And I think, again, if there were to be a change in a later iteration of biodiversity net gain, that again, some expertise, perhaps the criteria could be that it's native, or something around the fact that that species being non-native is the best kind of option for that environment, or something that is definitive enough that it's not just wishy-washy and anyone can say, oh yeah, we chose this tree because it's the best because it was the cheapest, for example.
Yeah,
That's not
so
what
there
we
needs
want.
to be a reasoned argument, because obviously, the song goes, let me take you by the hand and walk you through the streets of London. And quite frankly, the brilliant London tree officers have planted arboretums along our streets of the most diverse and successful and beautiful trees, delivering great ecosystem services, beauty, sense of place, defining landscape character by clever use of unusual species. So it would be sad if that sort of good practice was stopped.
Yeah,
But
I suppose one thing I would say is that some of the other condition criteria, if the wrong tree is planted in the wrong place and it doesn't persist, firstly that tree just may fail, and then it's not going to be good when they go back and do the monitoring, but also it might end up failing some of the other criteria, the condition criteria, because it was the wrong tree. And so, to some extent, if the right tree is chosen and it's non-native, it fails that criteria, but it will pass the others. And so there is some element of the non-native tree sometimes still being the right choice, even though there's a preference towards native.
I've got another listener question from Laura Cohen from Place Services. She's an assistant landscape consultant. What's better? How can we mitigate the loss of, say, a group of trees planted as a plantation? Or can we say that it's going to be okay to thin that group out? What are the thoughts in terms of BNGs? Let's say we lost a lot, or we thinned it out to maximise its value, so we couldn't call it a derelict landscape, is the phrase she uses here.
Yeah, so I think there are probably some exceptions, but within the biodiversity net gain categories, if something were to be categorised as a woodland, then the removal of trees from within that woodland, it's accepted that, of course, that can improve the biodiversity value of that woodland. It's normal woodland management, and that actually does not constitute the removal of trees. It doesn't get marked down for that. If anything, it may get marked up because the condition of that woodland habitat can get increased. If a block of woodland or a block of trees was removed to be replaced with a different habitat type, then that does cause a deficit. It gets taken into the calculator as the loss of one habitat type, and something else will replace it. So if that previous habitat type was in poor condition, it's not carrying such a high value, and it's removed and it's replaced with something more biodiverse, then hopefully the calculator should recognize that, and it would cause a positive effect. If it's not and it's replaced with a lawn, then of course that is going to result in a negative result in the calculator for the loss of that habitat.
I think Laura will be pleased to hear that, because she recognises that these have huge value and should be enhanced and not just removed because they may be categorised as low value in a tree report. So no, thank you very much for that, Simon. And I've got a final question for you from another friend of the show, and he is my friend Neil Davis, who is a well-known ARB, who is vice chair of the Arboricultural Association. And what he plans to do is brilliant, Neil, so I hope you do this. He is thinking of buying a piece of land and changing it from mown pasture to a wet woodland, which is a really scarce habitat here in the UK, one that's been sort of overlooked. And the idea is that he funds the planting and maintenance by a combination of folk paying him to do it as BNG off-site credits. And as and he wants to use it, because it's a great one for working with communities, as an educational resource for schools and Cub Scout groups and the like. So he's basically asking you, how does he get involved with being a BNG receptor site for credits? What does he need to do?
Well, it's a great idea, Neil, and I think you should definitely do it. I'll be pleased. I'd love to see it when it's done. And I think it'd be a great case study to encourage more people to do the same thing. And actually, when I think of biodiversity net gain over the last couple of years, this is one of the key kind of, exciting things that I was thinking of, is actually the potential for people to get hold of land, maybe land that's not been doing much, or whatever, spare pieces of land, and just make them as biodiverse as possible. Great. So in terms of how to get that sort of on the market, I think we are still talking about quite a developing marketplace. Essentially, it is a free market. Anyone is able to do what you're proposing, make some enhancements to some land. If it's to be used as off-site offsetting, it needs to be registered onto Natural England's off-site offsetting register. And apart from that, I think there are schemes in some local authorities to kind of hold a portal, a kind of marketplace portal, where kind of purveyors of biodiversity net gain can be linked up with the right developers who need to purchase that gain. And because of the trading rules, some of those are going to need, developers will need, 2 units of grassland, and some will need 1.5 units of woodland and whatever else. So it's already some local authorities are making those steps to link up the right people. But I hope that as that market develops, it will become more formalized. There'll be more of an idea of what should these things cost. It will be hopefully, a competitive marketplace, so that there's the right cost to developers, a competitive market. The truth is, right now I'm not aware of any absolute go-to marketplace for that, but probably the best people to ask, hopefully, would be the local planning authorities, because they need developers to be able to find this off-site offsetting land, these credits. They're going to be assessing planning applications all the time, which say, the shortfall is going to be met by off-site credits that are going to be purchased on the market, and they, more than anyone, are going to want to make sure that can actually happen. Otherwise, there's going to be a bit of a backlog of developments not able to meet their 10% gain, even though they've got a planning permission to crack on with it.
So Neil, get going with it. Sounds fabulous.
And also, just to say, the sooner you can get it in there, you actually can get sort of more credit for having it prepared in advance.
Brilliant. That's absolutely brilliant. So we've got a new government here, as I said earlier, and every government wants to make its mark. And there's going to be a revision of the National Planning Policy Framework. I had a quick look at that, and I'm not going to make any comments on what I think. But one of the questions they're asking at the moment, should there be any additional protection for habitats, such as peat soils, and compensatory mechanisms for basically the UK government now wants to increase sustainable energy. Sounds great. So do you think, as an ecologist, there should be any additional measures other than what we already have with our existing legislation to protect, say, peat soils?
Well, yeah, by all means, I think that the planning policy framework already kind of identified irreplaceable habitats, and the biodiversity net gain system does that as well. I think obviously as discussed, we've potentially got veteran trees that aren't really very, very veteran trees being classed as irreplaceable habitats, which would be the same protection really as something that really is irreplaceable. And yeah, I think that if they were able to get some more up-to-date protection of the absolute very best habitats, like the ancient woodlands, I think are already in there, but peat soils, if they're not already in there, and really, it's a great chance to include more than before.
Oh, I've got a late entry question here. Oh, it's from Noel. Pause for jingle.
Noel's question.
Noel actually can't be here right now, but he wants to know about compliance. It's all very well doing all this calculation, but what if they don't bother to look after it and they don't bother to do it? And the council perhaps haven't got a lot of funds to look into it. How does that work?
Yeah, it's a great question. This one that a lot of people have been asking, and I think still are asking, is that, all the effort goes in at the planning application stage to make all the numbers add up and present something really ambitious and great looking. And there's a planning condition then applied to secure that design that achieves the right biodiversity net gain numbers. But then that needs to stay in place and be maintained for 30 years thereafter, and all sorts of things can happen in that time. Certainly changes of staff, changes of ownership, and that would need to be secured. If it weren't, then ultimately I think it does fall to the planning authority to insist upon monitoring reports, whether those would be done by themselves or more likely perhaps by ecologists, for example, who are engaged by the site owner. But what I hope is that when we do those monitoring reports and submit them, and they may say that that what was promised hasn't been done or isn't being achieved, that they'll have the resources to act on that and actually make sure that the right changes are made, or as well a backup system for those cases where it's not feasible to now plant a tree there where there was supposed to be a tree, or create a habitat because it's now a car park or something like that. What happens then? What are the penalties? Perhaps the landowner would need to then buy the off-site credit, and maybe that's what needs to happen. But without a decent resource within the local authorities to be able to check those things, then nothing will happen and people will get away with it. So I really hope that there will be a system in place, but that's a lot of data to manage, a lot of sites to monitor over 30 years worth of a rolling 30 years worth of planning applications, all constantly being monitored.
Noel's question of the week.
So, two things come out of that. Quick question, how much is a BNG credit?
It's a good question. It's not one I have in front of me. I've got the number. I mean, first thing is it totally depends on the habitat type.
Okay.
I've got a number in my head which I think is typically, let's say, £28,000 for a one unit. But one unit is something that comes out of the calculator. It might be that they need half a unit or quarter of a unit.
And the other thing I want to say is I'm going to stand on my own soapbox. I've been talking for ages about every local authority needs a green infrastructure enforcement officer funded by Section 106 agreements. And that suitably qualified person would look at all things tree, landscape and ecology. That's me. That's my agenda. That's a bit naughty of me, really.
I absolutely agree. That would be great.
So we're all finding our way with BNG, and inevitably it's going to be updated at some point, hopefully in consultation with everybody. What would you like to see in the next iteration of BNG?
Yeah, well, I think that one thing that I would encourage is that everyone who has any involvement in BNG really engage with it. And I think, to answer your question, what I would like to see within it are opportunities for the correct experts to be able to make judgments needed. So we talked about the veteran tree distinction earlier on, perhaps the category U trees that currently could be seen as sidelining the expertise of arboriculturalists. And actually, what I would encourage is, even though what we're working with currently is not perfect, I would encourage everyone to engage with it. Really try and understand it. It can seem overwhelming, but every single part of BNG is fairly understandable. It's just that there's a lot of it for everyone right now. So I'd encourage everyone to engage. Don't abandon it. And hopefully in the next round of changes, whenever that might be, they could build in those chances that, for example, a suitably competent arboriculturalist can determine a certain factor, so that we're not simplifying it so much that there's no longer any room for expertise to get the right decisions, to get the right habitats and trees that will last in the future, and not being overly protective of the ones that really aren't the ones that should be kept for the future.
Simon, that is absolutely brilliant. You've really encapsulated, I think, what's on a lot of people's minds right now. It also speaks to that collaboration between allied professionals and how important that is, and actually the joy of sharing knowledge with each other of our own fields of expertise, because people love to learn. So I really thank you for putting so clearly what is a very complex and new subject. Many of us do not go into our industries to do a bunch of spreadsheets and look at a load of sums and do the math, as they say. That's not why we got into things, but we've had to learn, and it's important because measuring and quantifying and putting a financial value on things does speak to change, rightly or wrongly. So Simon Thomas, Director of Ecology at Tim Moyer Associates, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks very much, Sharon. Great to see you.
Well, I just want to thank you for taking the time to listen to Tree Lady Talks and just really honouring your own learning and thinking you're going to find out new stuff. Well, Noel and I work really hard to produce this podcast, and we love it. It's a real privilege, and we really enjoy speaking to our guests. But could you help us out? Could you please subscribe to this podcast and check out our really young YouTube channel at Tree Lady Talks and subscribe there. And if you think you know someone who might benefit from this podcast, could you share it with a couple of people so we can grow it? Because if we can continue to grow this podcast, we can reach wider audiences, and we can continue to bring you great guests. All of this costs Noel and I money. We ask for nothing in return other than your support, and we would love your feedback. You can either reply at fan mail on the Buzzsprout website, or contact me on LinkedIn, that's Sharon Durdant Hollenby, or you can email at treeladytalks@gmail.com. So thank you, listeners. We really care about you. We want to bring you great content.